In 49 BC, Roman statesman Marcus Tullius Cicero sent a letter to his friend Atticus informing him about the current gossip in Rome. This time, the big news involved the famous Mark Antony. Marcus Antonius, Cicero writes in disgust, is carrying Cytheris about with him in an open litter, like a second wife. Apart from being Antony's mistress, Cytheris was also a famous actress who was known to be the mistress of several other notable Roman leaders. Cicero was even more surprised 2 years later to find Cytheris at a dinner party, reclining in a position of honor next to the host as if she were the lady of the house instead of a lowly mistress. After the party, Cicero immediately wrote to his other friend, Paetus, to express his outrage. Considering Cicero's apparent fury about Antony and his mistress, one could easily envision him being well nigh having a heart attack if he had lived to witness Emperor Nero's relationship with his wives and lovers many years later. The life of Emperor Nero Claudius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, was brief but colorful. His marriages and relationships were also brief and colorful, with most of them ending on a gruesome note. He forced his first wife, Octavia, to commit suicide and kicked his second wife, Poppaea Sabina, to death during her pregnancy, after she reprimanded him for arriving home late from the races. In 66 AD, Nero compelled consul Marcus Junius Festinus Atticus, the husband of his former mistress Statilia Messalina, to commit suicide so he could marry her. Then there were his lovers, among them Acte, Pythagoras, and Sporus. Born either in the late 39 AD or early 40 AD, Claudia Octavia was the only daughter of Emperor Claudius by his third wife, Valeria Messalina. When she was about 8 years old, her father had her mother executed and proceeded to marry his fourth wife, her cousin, Agrippina the Younger. Nero, 2 or 3 years Octavia's senior, was Agrippina's son from her marriage to Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus. To the surprise of most people around him, Claudius began to show preference towards Nero as his successor over his own son Britannicus, Octavia's brother. In 50 AD, Claudius officially adopted Nero and bestowed upon him the title Princeps Juventutis, Prince of Youth, a year later. Arranged by their parents, Octavia married her adopted brother Nero in 53 AD. Claudius died the following year at the age of 63, just before Britannicus attained the age of legal manhood, which was 14 years. Apart from Agrippina's scheming to have Nero declared Claudius's heir and Claudius's evident favoritism towards Nero, Britannicus's age alone would disqualify him from being pronounced emperor, as he would have been too young to rule Rome alone. Although their marriage appears to have been loveless and childless, when Nero succeeded Claudius as emperor, Octavia was made empress. This did not mean, however, that she became a powerful woman. Nero's mother, Agrippina, was the most powerful woman in the Roman political sphere. However, Nero grew to despise his mother and declared his independence from her at the age of 18. Only 2 years after his marriage to Octavia, Nero fell in love with a former slave named Claudia Acte and began an affair with her. Acte was a freed woman from Asia province, and while she was not a professional prostitute, her ambiguous status as one of many royal concubines gave her the same social standing as Cytheris. Although Octavia's reaction to this relationship was never recorded, Agrippina clearly disapproved of Nero's choice of mistress. However, it did not matter to Nero, as he was by then independent of his mother's influence. In response to her diminishing influence over Nero, Agrippina threatened to switch her allegiance to Britannicus, Octavia's brother, as a better candidate for emperor. Nero allegedly poisoned Britannicus soon after during a family dinner. When Agrippina then joined forces with Octavia to increase her power, Nero deposed his mother's personal bodyguard and forced her to flee the palace. Like Cytheris, who took on other powerful men, apart from Antony, as her lovers, Acte was also initially identified as the mistress of Nero's companions Otho, Senecio, and Serenus. However, this could have been a misidentification. either due to Agrippina's dominance or a sense of propriety, while Nero himself would meet with her surreptitiously. She is described as a muliercula nulla cuiusquam inuria, a little woman, no one's injury. Nero's associates, particularly the political faction opposed to Agrippina, actively promoted, if not formed, Nero's relationship with Acte. Seneca, Nero's advisor, sought out a woman to capture Nero's interest and introduced him to Acte. Seneca then proceeded to use Acte as a pawn to weaken Agrippina's power. This dynamic is also apparent in descriptions of Acte as a contrast and opposition to Agrippina in Tacitus's tale, in which she is the submissive, obedient, loving woman, as opposed to Nero's mother's controlling, demanding, and aggressive character. For Nero's advisors, his pairing with Acte made sense. They reasoned that, because he despised his wife, he should have a harmless sexual release, rather than seek debauchery with respectable women, who would either be humiliated or would exploit an affair with the Emperor of Rome to acquire power. Because Acte was not an elite woman from a prominent family, her low social status made her unthreatening. In contrast, in her thirst for power, Agrippina supposedly attempted to seduce her son. Suetonius and Cassius Dio emphasized the significance of the relationship even further, claiming that Nero viewed Acte as his primary life partner, despite his concurrent marriage to Octavia. According to Suetonius, Nero all but made the freedwoman Acte his lawful wife quin justo sibi matrimonio conjungere, that he should not join himself in a lawful marriage, after bribing certain former consuls to falsely claim that she was of royal descent. Cassius Dio adds to this by claiming that Nero was taking steps to marry Acte by attempting to arrange Acte's adoption into the Attalids, a royal Greek dynasty that ruled the Pergamon kingdom, to give her the elite status necessary for her to marry him. This act conveys the enormity of Nero's desire for her and Acte's position of power. However, the intended royal adoption and subsequent marriage failed, most likely due to the arrival of Nero's new love interest in 58 AD, the elite, affluent, and inconveniently married Poppaea Sabina. Tacitus claims that Poppaea persuaded Nero to marry her by claiming that she did not want to risk an illegitimate liaison with him when she already had a respectable and lofty marriage, whereas he was tied down to a concubine housemaid, Acte, who could give him nothing but lowly associations. Poppaea reframed Acte in Nero's mind as a negative influence who degraded the emperor's social rank and tainted him with infamy, rather than as the innocent, harmless object of Nero's affection, described by Nero's male associates. Poppaea was married to her second husband Otho, who later would become emperor, whom she divorced to marry Nero. Unlike Acte, who was of low birth and thus could be Nero's mistress, as he continued to be married to Octavia, Poppaea was a high-born lady, and thus required Nero to divorce Octavia for her to be able to marry him. Poppaea would have been a nightmare for Nero's advisors, as she embodied everything they feared, a high-born lady who would accept nothing less than marriage to the Emperor of Rome, and an ambitious woman who would not hesitate to use her influence over the emperor for her own benefit. Tacitus's portrayal of Poppaea is significantly more unfavorable than his portrayal of Acte. In Tacitus's eyes, the high-born Roman matron was far more immoral than the freedwoman, and a far more pernicious influence on Nero. Poppaea's political influence over Nero, as well as her own attempts to promote and advance the status of her birth family, posed a danger to the male politicians and intellectuals like Seneca, who had hitherto held power. After their marriage in 62 AD, Poppaea gave Nero a daughter, his only living child, Claudia Augusta. By 65 AD, she was pregnant with his second child. Although Statilia Messalina was Nero's third and final wife, almost nothing is known about her.
History does not record the precise date of her birth or death, but she might have been born around 35 AD. She was born into a famous senatorial family and was the great-granddaughter of Titus Statilius Taurus, a renowned consul during the reign of Augustus. Due to the lack of knowledge in historical sources, only one of Statilia Messalina's 4 previous marriages is known, before her union with Nero, namely to a man named Atticus Festinus. In 65 AD, Atticus Festinus was a consul and one of Emperor Nero's closest associates. This friendship did not survive long, however, because Nero resented Atticus Festinus's marriage with Statilia Messalina, who, before her wedding to Atticus Festinus, was already Nero's lover, as well as mistress to other powerful men. Around this time, a conspiracy to assassinate and depose Emperor Nero was revealed. This scheme was quickly uncovered, and all the conspirators were put to death by Nero's edict. This also provided an opportunity for Nero to get rid of his adversary. Taking advantage of the situation, Nero dispatched a contingent of soldiers to the house of Atticus Festinus to accuse him of being a part of the conspiracy and ordered the seizure of all his property. According to Tacitus, when the soldiers informed him that the tribune was calling for him, Atticus Festinus was calmly fulfilling his duties, hosting a feast. He rose, and events accelerated as he was promptly locked in a bedroom with a doctor who then cut open his veins. That same year, 65 AD, the pregnant Poppaea Sabina succumbed due to Nero kicking her in the stomach. The death of both spouses cleared the way for Nero's union with Statilia Messalina. The wedding of Emperor Nero and Statilia took place in early 66 AD, and Statilia was given the title Augusta after her marriage. When Nero accepted the submission of Tiridates I, king of Armenia, the new empress was already at his side, as they embarked for Greece with a large following. When they returned to Rome, it was possible that Statilia proceeded to lead a life separate from her husband, and immersed herself in her love of the arts and literature. Juvenal mentions that she was adept at literary discourses, such as critical comparisons between the writings of Virgil and Homer. Nero spent his final days at Horti Serviliani and subsequently at Villa Faionte, where he committed suicide in 68 AD. After his death, his heirs spared Statilia Messalina and her whole inheritance. This was because Nero's successors, Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, hailed from the same senatorial circles as Nero. They would have recognized Statilia Messalina's pedigree and the possible advantages of being associated with her. According to Suetonius, Emperor Otho planned to marry Statilia before his successor Vitellius, who conquered him, prevented him from doing so. Due to his defeat, Otho resolved to commit suicide. However, before his suicide, he had already sent a letter to the widow of Nero, whom he intended to marry, commending his ashes and memory. Statilia Messalina was also barely affected by damnatio memoriae, as shown by the inscriptions of the columbarium of servants and freedmen of the gens. Statilia discovered in the 19th century on the Esquiline, Messalina uxor Neronis, Messalina, wife of Nero, was continued to be referred to in an epigraph in Boeotia, commemorating the independence that Nero granted to Greece, where her name was erased, along with Nero's name. Nero is also known to have taken on at least 2 men as his lovers. One of them was Pythagoras, one of Nero's favorite freedmen. In 64 AD, Nero played the role of the veiled bride and held a wedding ceremony with Pythagoras as his groom. 3 years later, in 67 AD, the emperor castrated and married a young man named Sporus. Wedding ceremony notwithstanding, both these men were, in effect, Nero's mistresses, as Nero was still married to Poppaea and Statilia respectively. Sporus's story was especially tragic as he caught the emperor's eye due to his supposed striking likeness to Poppaea Sabina, whom Nero had killed in 65 AD. Not much is known about him apart from his association with Nero. His name Sporus is derived from the Greek word which means seed or sowing. So this was likely not his real name, and instead a mocking term conferred upon him to insult his failure to produce heirs. Cassius Dio also claims that Nero addressed the boy as Sabina, thus depriving him even further of his own male identity. It is unknown if Sporus was a slave or a freedman. However, his status in life was low enough for Nero to take him as a lover, even as he was already married to Statilia. According to Suetonius, Nero castrated Sporus before wrapping him in a woman's stola and veils and announcing to the world that his beloved was now a woman. In 67 A.D., he even married the boy and made him slash her, his wife and new empress.
Eunuchs had the potential to be immensely influential in Rome and abroad. Without their legacy or progeny, they were regarded as neutral players, typically placed in positions of power or female families. Bagoas, Alexander the Great's favorite, a Persian eunuch who became a trusted companion, and Pothinus, the counselor to Ptolemy VIII, Cleopatra's brother/husband, are two renowned examples from the ancient world. However, this was not the case for Sporus. He would have lacked the connection and the education to achieve this position.
The context of his castration was also more sinister. Castration would have been an easy way for Nero to eliminate his potential rival. Additionally, a sexually abused youngster who was very publicly treated like a woman at the emperor's feet would never be taken seriously as a contender for the throne. Thus, Sporus had no more power than a slave, despite his new status as Nero's consort. Statilia was still the most powerful woman in Rome and still married to the emperor, despite living apart from him. In 68 A.D., while Nero was taking New Year's auspices, Sporus presented the emperor with a ring portraying the rape of Proserpina. Intentionally or not, the gift was quite symbolic of Sporus's relationship with Nero, who, like Pluto dragging Proserpina to hell, also dragged Sporus to this new lifestyle with little regard to his desires or well-being. Gifting such a thing to Nero at the start of the new year would have been regarded at best as impolite and at worst as a bad omen. Nero, as fate would have it, would die before the end of the year. After the Senate declared Nero a public enemy, he fled Rome, taking Sporus with him. When a courier notified Nero that the Senate intended to have him executed, Nero's private secretary, Epaphroditus, assisted Nero in driving a knife through his neck to avoid the impending public execution. However, Nero's death was not the end of Sporus's story. Sporus was passed on to the Praetorian Guard, Nymphidius Sabinus, who kept Sporus in his function as a eunuch companion. Sporus then traveled to serve Otho, Poppaea Sabina's first husband, whom she had divorced to marry Nero. Otho died by suicide soon after, rather than succumbing to a coup by Vitellius. After becoming emperor in 69 A.D., Vitellius requested that Sporus play the titular role in the rape of Proserpina, as part of a gladiatorial show. Rather than face the humiliation of recreating the part that he had played in real life for Nero, Sabinus, and Otho for all of Rome, Sporus committed suicide. Sporus's name lives on for thousands of years as a term for eunuchs and contempt, even making it into Lord Byron's verse, Sporus, that mere white curd of ass's milk. Satire or sense, alas, can Sporus feel, who breaks a butterfly upon a wheel? Out of all Nero's wives and lovers, it was perhaps Acte who had the best fate. Suetonius informs that after the disgraced Nero committed suicide, and at a time when the entire city of Rome was in tumult and chaos, his old nurses and Acte quietly stole his body and buried him with customary rituals. The burial was paid for with Acte's own money, and his ashes were interred in the Domiti family tomb. Later in her life, Acte possessed substantial properties in North Africa, and she was able to spend the exorbitant sum of 200,000 sestertii on Nero's funeral and burial. As Tacitus appears to commend Acte for this ostensibly generous act, Rather than criticizing her for her wealth or ostentation, one can also assume that by the time Nero died, her station in life had already improved. Otherwise, Tacitus would likely have rebuked her, if not for acting as a wife when she was only a mere mistress, as Cicero would probably have done to Cytheris, then for acting above her station. The public remembrance of her property also implies that her economic prosperity was not hidden or considered disgraceful.